duties and activities that they are supposed to render to this country, that they are supposed to render to the members of Uganda, to the citizens of Uganda, and without a constituted commission. It means that there will be no match. They can't do much. And so, failure, where these members are not nominated, and where no activities are going on with the Judicial Service Commission. Our vulnerable people who are yelling, the litigants, the people who need these services, clearly are unable to get the services. And also our voices as members of the Ugandan Law Society is required in this commission. And so our prayers and our request to the Judicial Service Commission is that, to the judiciary, is that let our matters be before court, with expenditures to be fixed and handled, so that we are able to have our members forwarded and nominated to these positions. And indeed, this will help so much, especially in dispensation of justice. As we all know, justice delayed, justice denied. And so, if the Judicial Service Commission not constituted, the impact is immense. Clearly, this will certainly affect service delivery, which in turn will cause a miscarriage of justice. And also, of course, there will be wastage of public resources, because if these activities, the Judicial Service Commission handled, and yet some of the members already appointed, others already replaced, it is a serious issue, it's a serious problem that needs to be tackled. So, in a nutshell, as members of the Council, members of the Uganda Law Society, and the candidates themselves, as you may be aware, there were already campaigns going on, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of issues, a lot of concerns. All this can all be settled. Can be put to rest if these cases are attended. So, without and so, finally, we have an application question that I would like to very quickly read. Uganda Law Society condemns court delays endangering the President Semugate and obstructing counsel. The Uganda Law Society expresses great concern about the inflictable delays affecting numerous ongoing legal proceedings involving our organization and its president, Mr. Isaac Kimani, Senior Counsel. These delays create the impression of animosity between the judiciary and the Uganda Law Society. The Uganda Law Society requires the current impasse where courts refuse to schedule hearing dates for cases filed by Mr. Samukete, who faces multiple arrest warrants, including an international one from Uganda, Human Resources, Ronald Gaizi. He was also sentenced to 2 years in prison for contempt of court by Judge Musa Satana in February 2025, allegedly for derogating social media remarks. Chief Justice Alphonse Windol banned Semakande's speech at the 2025 new law year operating, demanding an apology for alleged insults, escalating tensions. The Ugandan state previously called for cordial engagements with the judiciary, top management. And that was January 16 months later. An Honorable Norbert, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, offered to facilitate mediation, and our response remains to resolve the relevant cases promptly. And then, as far as the mediation summit is concerned, a mediation summit of power bench leaders should not obstruct the timely disposal of cases concerning the President's personal liberty, the democratic mandate of the legal profession, and the services owed to the government, the Judicial Service Commission, and the judiciary itself, and the public. Several cases are pending, including number one, the High Court Criminal Division Business Application, number 30 of 2025. An implication by the President, Semakade, for a stay of suspension of the private prosecution case at Uganda Road Magistrate Court. This matter remains adjourned Sunday, with the ruling to be delivered on notice. Number two, the High Court Civil Division Business Application number 137 of 2025. An application for stay of execution or suspension of Judge Sekana's conviction and 2-year sentence against the President Semakade. This application has not been allowed, has not been allocated judge or a hearing date. Number three, a trio of appeals at the Court of Appeal. And civil appeals, number 98, number 99, and number 102, arising from Judge Sekana's decision to cancel the Uganda Law Society, EGM. Number four, High Court Civil Division Business Application number 33 of 2025. The habeas corpus application concerning the military detention of Uganda Law Society's member, Advocate Aaron Kiza. As the governing body for the legal practitioners in Uganda, we emphasize the prompt resolution of these cases, which is essential to safeguarding President Semakade's rights, restore confidence in the judicial system, and uphold the principles of justice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our position as counsel. Thank you very much. So now I invite the moderator to take us on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Egari. I now would like to invite the moderator for the first issue, Mr. Isiko Arthur.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be moderating the second phase of this discussion. The theme is beyond dominion, what next? As you all know, Dominion Limited had a 20-year power distribution concession with the government of Uganda, which ended in March 2025, just last year. On the 1st of April 2025, Uganda Electricity Distribution Company Limited took over electricity distribution, infrastructure, and we have had reports, clashes over government payouts for women. There has also been a lot of public fear in regards to whether this transition will cause a change in the tariff charges, load shedding, or constant blackouts. To address this issue or concerns, we're going to make a Mr. Alan Nalukola, where you also the energy desk, where you also the energy desk. He served as the legal and compliance manager at Capital Markets Authority, where he also oversaw the development of the legal and regulatory framework of Uganda's capital markets. He was a senior legal officer with Uganda Electricity Transmission Company and Government Council Forum, an association that promotes the in-house council community in Africa. For those who read the Daily Monitor, there was a phrase that said, "Meme hands over power is free." We have issues, debates, on whether it is always peaceful transition in this country. Allow me to invite Mr. Alan Nalukola to elaborate further on this issue.
The question is, we have to be very delicate in the way of answering especially the last question about handover of power. Like introducing, my name is Alan Nalukola. I'm the head of legal services at Uganda Limited, which until 2 days ago was the largest distributor in the East. Right now, the service provider is Uganda Electricity Distribution Company Limited. I presume that when you turn on the lights today, which means that when the first concession ended, that started in 1999, and it led to the establishment of the Electricity Act of 1999. Before that, I don't know how many of you remember UEB. You might have heard about it from your parents or something. I was there. UEB was a single, vertically integrated utility provider. It handled generation, distribution, transmission, and it did not have a regulator. So if UEB said this is what was going on, UEB was the way. The government felt that it was important to attract private capital, attract better management, because at that time UEB was in debt and struggling, and there were many things that they could not do because they did not have enough financing, and the network was, the one they did was dilapidated. So in the 90s, Uganda started seeing growth, and they needed an energy sector that could keep up with the development. Because if you have industrialization and you don't have electricity that's keeping up, then you don't have, the industry won't come. They'll just find a way to get electricity. So they decided to unbundle UEB and form 3 companies. So the assets that UEB used for generating power were given to Uganda Electricity Generation Company Limited, which is a Ugandan-owned generation company. The next assets were transmission assets, which where the power that comes from the generation plant is sent at high voltage to a substation, which is, I think at that time the highest voltage was 132 kilovolts, which is these metallic towers that most of us see. They've since made them much higher and gone up to 220. Then the distribution assets were given to a company called Uganda Electricity Distribution Company. So I think the word we should have used was Umeme hands back the network. So Uganda Electricity Distribution Company is the legal owner of the distribution network, and it has always been. Umeme did not own the network. So UEB was vested into those 3 companies, which are called successor companies. One great thing that the 1999 Electricity Act did was they established a regulator. Harold has kept me honest for 10 years in the Umeme, and a few years extra when I was in UETCL in the previous leg. The regulator is supposed to oversee, firstly license, so they control your entry. They oversee how you operate, and then they set the tariff, so they also control your The regulator has been overseeing operations, especially with regard to the private sector participating. So in 2005, Umeme executed 3 agreements and got 2 licenses. The agreements were that they would take a lease, and they use the word lease of distribution assets a bit loosely because the legal ownership always remained with UEDCL. What Umeme got was the right to possess and operate. So you're operating an asset if you know is UEDCL. So whenever we built a power line, whenever we built a substation, the asset was registered in the names of Uganda Electricity Distribution Company. So Umeme basically had 2 arms. One, they were a utility for purposes of operations, but they were an investment company. Their job was to attract capital, invest that capital into improving the network, through building power lines, connecting people, building substations, improving reliability. At that time in 2005, there were concerns about power theft and power losses. They believed that about 38% of the power that was generated and sold never made it to the final consumer. So the final consumer was paying more than he should have because of theft. Then the targets were a reduction in profit. I mean a reduction in power losses, which are both technical and non-technical. In the 20 years, I think the power losses have dropped from 38% to just about 16% right now. So Umeme had that target, and the target is enforced by the regulator. So there's an incentive and a penalty for not either meeting it or not meeting it. There were also issues with collection. People were, if there was a delay in collecting bills, you still had to pay the generator at the time. So the collections led to a few issues. So Umeme's task was to collect. Now, I'm sure many of you are on the prepaid system. So rolling out the prepaid system helped with collections and helped make the sector more financially viable. And then the third was issues on reliability. So if your power was going out at the time, Umeme's job was to make sure that we kept the lights on. And those targets were given by the regulator. So in the 20 years, I think we've seen a great improvement, mainly because of Umeme's ability to attract capital and also the skills that were developed. So Umeme set up in 2005 and got to the lease and assignment agreement, the power sales agreement, where we bought power from the Uganda Electricity Transmission Company. We had a support agreement with the government of Uganda, which was supposed to help with our investments. Then the regulator gave us 2 licenses. One was a distribution license and one was a supply license. Now, Umeme ran 2 tracks. The first was a utility. So for consumers, Umeme's job was to make sure that power was reliable, power was available. If you wanted a connection, I'm sure if you tried to get a connection in 2005, it was much harder than a connection now. So we set up a framework where you could actually apply for connection online, get most data connection in a shorter time than before. I think we have a target of 5 days after the documents are done. We had a target of 5 days after the documents are received. And the idea was to run the network for 20 years, develop it, develop capacity, and when you're done, hand it back to the government, which is going to run it. If they did not feel ready, they would have given us an extension. But there was a strategic decision that the government would take over Umeme. Now, 5 years ago, Umeme had to do a study to see how the network was operating. It was reviewed 2 years ago. They called it the state of the network, where they were asking the question, has Umeme run the network prudently? That was very necessary because that was the network was supposed to hand back to Uganda Electricity Distribution Company. And the network that was handed back 2 days ago is much bigger than what was given to us 5 years ago. I think Harold gave the numbers that leave that for you. Just a quick one. In 2005, Umeme had 2 main shareholders. CDC, which is the UK government investment arm, and ESCOM, which was coming for technical capacity, because they are the ones who were running the dam. In 2006, they left. ESCOM left. So whenever you hear saying a South African company, ESCOM was there for 1 year. ESCOM exited, Actis took over, which is also a UK investment fund. And then in 2012, Umeme had an IPO and they were listed in the Uganda Securities Exchange. They've been one of the most active counters in the Uganda Securities Exchange, and they have contributed to the growth of our capital markets. Now in 2017, there was a sale of shares where NSSF now became the biggest shareholder in Umeme. So right now, if you're paying your NSSF, most lawyers are, I think by the time you get your PC approved, you must show you have to pay your NSSF. So NSSF is the biggest shareholder, and they are the ones who are major stakeholders. We have a representative on our board, and whenever we have to look at issues that regard shareholders, NSSF is the biggest. We do have other funds. There are very many other shareholders that come in. I think we're about 5,000 shareholders plus. Many of you might be. So the question on the buyout amount, which has been making the news, is basically a question of you bring a private sector player, you have certain needs in the sector, like I mentioned, attracting investments, getting reliable power, selling and collecting. So Umeme's job was simply identify this problem, invest resources, both capital and human resources, solve the problem, get a return on investment. The agreements that are in place identify the kind of investments Umeme makes. They provide a framework for the regulator to approve them. And when you're done with the investment, the regulator allows them to be recovered from the tariff. There is no disagreement between Umeme and the government of that part, in principle, that once there's an investment, you have an entitlement to a return on capital and the return on investment which you're entitled to. I think because we have been investing for 20 years, the real question was, did you invest the amounts that were expected? Now the Auditor General, under the agreement, has the right to audit the investment amounts, which the Auditor General did. And he came up with a figure of, I think, $118 million. That did not take into account what we have been investing now, because it was a bit of a historical check. But the agreement also provides that at the end of the concession, which was 2 days ago, Umeme will provide a figure which reflects what Umeme thinks is its investment. So there is a discrepancy between what Umeme expects and what the government and the Auditor General said Umeme would get. That is also expected, because under the concession agreements, which this is information which is public, at the end of the concession, the government and Umeme are supposed to sit in a room and do a reconciliation. Some may call it a dispute, some may call it a face-off, but it is a reconciliation. I've never, like most lawyers, I never really quarrel with numbers. This is a numbers game. Investments have been reported, have been approved, they've been recorded, and now the documents have been audited. So we have a period, a window, through which Umeme and the government of Uganda will sit down, reconcile the amounts, and agree. So that is still going on. I cannot tell you how it is going to end, because we still have about 30 days. But from what we have been talking to the government about, it is very cordial, and it is expected to happen very well. I hope I've calmed you down. That's mainly for the shareholders of Umeme, because right now Umeme is not running the network. So if you are a consumer of electricity services, the last 2 days have shown that the network is still around, still owned by the government of Uganda, and the government of Uganda actually has the duty to provide you with what are the sustainable development goals, they call it, and it's goal number 7. You're supposed to have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. So that is the target, and it is aligned with the National Development Plan 4, which talks about access at about 80%. I know right now, on grid we are about 20%, and the total, including solar, is about 50%, which is a great jump from 8% 20 years ago, of course taking into account our population has more than doubled. So yes, so my final words, I think I've taken a lot of time. As a utility, Umeme handed over the network 2 days ago, and the lights are still on. So UEDC is currently running the network, and I think many of you, if you have tried to load power, you have been successful. UEDCL has had 2 years to prepare the handover. We've had meetings every month for the last 2 years. They've taken on about 90% of the women employees, so they've got the skills, and they intend to run it as efficiently and even better than women. That's their promise. And I think the good thing is the regulator is also still watching. So you've gone from a situation where it's a private sector attracting capital. Now I think UEDC is a pure utility, so they will be looking at more sides. So it's my hope, because I'm a consumer as well, that UEDC will actually take us forward. So this stage, this phase that we are on, we're actually in a growth trajectory, so there's a lot more needed. Uganda's demand rises by, I think, about 12 to 13% per year. So that's a big jump. So yes, so I think I'd just like to give you assurance that as a utility, UMEME has handed over a network that was run previously, and it has handed over a network that's still operating, it is not very big, and the network still belongs to the government of Uganda, and you should expect a properly run utility from UNICEF. As investors, if you're an investor in UMEME, the conversations are going on, and we do have a framework for that, which was a visit in the concession agreements. So thank you. I hope if you were worried the last 2 days and the fact that the power has not gone off, it should give you some comfort. I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owen. Insightful discussion. I think we can all agree that UMEME has done a bit of transformation. Remember, we should make these payments manually. Make applications for many manually, payments manually. Most of the workers, once you could they follow up with the payments for women, to do this to get our homes. For women, and why. But UMEME has been the commend for such a beautiful transition. This juncture, allow me introduce to Mr. Harold Odiga, who is our second discussant. Mr. Harold Odiga is the Director of Legal Services at the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda. He has over 15 years of extensive experience in legal policy, regulatory affairs, across various sectors, which include power, renewable energy, telecommunications, finance, and banking. Mr. Odiga's contributions to Uganda's electricity sector has been very transformative. Since 2012, he has provided strategic regulatory guidance for major publicly financed energy projects, significantly advanced in clean and renewable energy initiatives, and facilitating private capital investments. Mr. Odiga has further influenced the harmonization of electricity regulations across the southern and western Africa. He has worked with the Energy Regulators Association of the Eastern Africa, where he has played a role in establishing the Independent Regulatory Board, IRB, for the Eastern Africa Power Pool in 2023. He has also collaborated with regulators from 13 sub-Saharan countries to promote regional cooperation and sustainable energy development. Please allow me as a welcome Mr. Odiga. Let's give him a round of applause.
So good afternoon once again. I'll pick up from where Alan has dropped the ball, and I believe that by the end you will have the same confidence, I imagine. So if I don't take you there, please remind me. So where did we start? We are at a position where, as Alan has shared with us, what has happened is that there has been a change of the electricity sector from having the private sector running it to the public sector. And the underlying concerns that are raised are pretty familiar, and they are genuine. Blackouts, of course, affordability, which you have mentioned, concerning tariffs, and naturally financing. Now, when we go back to the reasons, and that question I think is answered by us looking back to the initial decision as to why we brought in Umeme Limited and what it has been able to do and what has since transpired forward. I'll speak largely with a view to a couple of things. Majorly, what has Umeme been able to see and how do we expect to carry that forward from this year and why we have these changes. As a government and as a sector in Uganda, we are in what we are calling the second generation reforms of the country. If you want to split the country, you can split it in various reforms. In 1999, after 1999, and then now. And what are we trying to achieve? Our objective as a government have not changed, and as a sector have not changed across the board. They remain the same. They remain access, they remain affordability, and speaking to tariffs, they also remain with a view to reliability. And I'm going to speak towards those. I'll start with the first, speaking to tariffs, okay? So one of the key concerns that we definitely have and why you are confidently able to flip on the switch and have on the lights is that you can afford that specific power. What are the things that have gone into that? Since the period that we've had, you will recall possibly if you are alive 20 years back from now, your tariff increased by 24%, okay? A couple of days ago, your tariff has not increased, it has reduced by 14%. So if you're asking yourself a question right now, am I able to actually flip on the light? Am I able to actually be able to have electricity? The answer right now is that you are more likely right now, today, than 20 years back to actually afford that electricity that you have on you. So UEDCL has come in as a government company. As ERA, we have licensed the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company, and it has taken the operations of Umeme Limited. In a similar vein, they have, so the licenses that Alan was holding and Umeme Limited of distribution of electricity and also supply of electricity are now being held by the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company. What does that mean? That simply means that the UEDCL and the government is the one now providing you that electricity. There are a couple of benefits to that. One of the first benefits that we need to be able to do is to have everyone have access to electricity. 10 years, 20 years ago, we've been struggling with access to electricity. Currently, access to electricity is at about 57%. Our desire is not to extend power to just the urban areas or the peri-urban areas, but also the rural areas. And who is the entity possibly best placed to do that? It is the government. Why is that the case? The case is that governments are able to, for instance, attract development finance at cheaper terms and on more concessional terms than the private sector. How is this playing out right now? You will recall that, for instance, two of the power projects that you have, that is Karuma and Isimba, have been publicly financed by the government of Uganda. So the long-term gain that we have is to have tariffs becoming affordable, government being able to attract financing to the sector, and then passing it on to the public sector. So that at the end of the day, when you switch on the lights, you actually have access to electricity. And that access has moved from about 11, I think 0.8% 20 years back to about 57%. Our desire is to move it to as high as 80% and to increase grid access, not just to keep it at the level of off-grid and on-grid. So these initiatives are actually geared to increasing finance in the sector, attracting development finance, and then seeing that at the end of the day, we are efficient. The other aspect that we've also got to ask ourselves is how do we deal with the issues of blackouts? Or why did we used to have blackouts? Why did we not used to have blackouts? When Umeme Limited came, our generation, I think, was slightly in the margin of about 500 megawatts or thereabout. Since then, right now, we are slightly above 2,000 megawatts. So we have increased possibly like 3 times. So it's not just, when we talk of power actually being there and us not having blackouts, whereas we interface, for instance, with Meme Limited and UEDC, we also have to understand that there is a full backstory that contributes to this. So one of the things that we've been able to do is, first of all, make sure that during this period of time, we actually have enough electricity. By the time Meme Limited came to this network, we didn't have enough electricity. We've been able to achieve that. We're slightly over about 2,000 megawatts in terms of our installed capacity. And then in terms of our peak capacity, in other words, what we are actually right now using, slightly in the region of about 1,100, 1,200. That gives us a good margin to assure the public that within the next period of time, we have secured the security of supply, and UEDC will actually have a product and a good to actually be. And we couldn't have done this without entities, possibly like Meme Limited, because one of the things they were also able to do is attract financing. So there is a big question out there in terms of, will the sector be able to continue attract financing of both public and private capital? My answer to that is possibly it's going to be a resounding yes. What we are seeing is that we can still attract financing in the sector based on the regulatory reforms. And this is the other thing that also affects your power consumption, is what Alan talked about, the availability of power. He talked of losses. 20 years back, those losses were at about 38%. Right now, they are slightly in the margin of about 16.9%, thereabout. What does that mean for you? That means, first of all, as ERA and as a sector, we have given UEDCL similar targets to Meme Limited, in the sense that as of now, UEDCL also has an obligation that in the next 3 years, they should have even taken that loss further from the 16% into the region of about 12%. The impact of that is that we have more electricity available for everyone to actually have. Simply put, we are not relaxing the requirement to perform to UEDCL. There is a thinking out there that because this is government, it is going to be inefficient. As a regulator, and from what we have seen in the market, is that that does not take us where we want to go. So the targets that Meme Limited have are actually still going to be carried forward by the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company, which means the benefit of us having the lights on is going to specifically stay. The other thing, of course, that is important is that 20 years back from now, we were not at a place where the market was financially sustainable. And this may feed into the discussion of buyout, how much money. What we have seen is that with the injections that we've had from the Meme Limited over the period of time in terms of investing in the network, in terms of us being able to deliver electricity, in terms of the reforms that we are able to make. Previously, we had subsidies. Right now, we no longer have subsidies. It's going to be the same thing. As a sector, we don't intend to introduce subsidies from the government necessarily. That's not necessarily the case. The reason being is that the sector still remains financially viable. I also would like to let you know specifically that if you ask yourself, why will you invest in a country? Okay? Why will you go to a country which you do not know about? One of the things that you will be comfortable about is that if I put in 1 shilling, I will actually be able to take out that 1 shilling. Also, that is not going to change. So everyone who invests in the network, everyone who invests in the country will always be able to get their money back. The advantage of that is not to be underscored, because the Ugandan electricity sector is just possibly one of 2 viable financial sectors on the African continent. And that is not a small achievement by far. It comes with us being able to pay generators on time, with us being able to pay the transmission company on time, and the distribution system on time. If you've looked through the tariff announcements that we have made of recent, what we instead expect to see is that same continuity. So we are not making definite changes. So if you ask me, why would your lights not have come on? your lights will possibly not have come on if someone who was producing electricity had not been paid. What I'm simply saying is that we still expect, because of the financial viability of the sector, to pay the people who produce electricity. And that should keep your specific lights on at any one point in time. The other concern, of course, is the number of changes that have happened 20 years. 20 years is a long period of time. You'll agree with me. 20 years ago, we would possibly make a strategic plan for how many years? For 10 years? Or maybe 20 years, 15 years? That has changed. Nowadays, you want to make plans for as low as 3 years. Those are company strategic plans. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we incorporate these changes? How can we respond to these changes as fast as possible so that people get the exact desired service? And that takes us to the question of electricity reform. Okay? So previously, everyone had to, for instance, buy power from one company, the Uganda Electricity Transmission Company, the UETCL. We have made changes to the market, and we are making changes to the market. If you are a big consumer, there are going to be possibilities for you to be able to buy power directly from the UETCL, or you may want to buy it from generation. All those changes. But remember, in this period of time, we have been having a contract which the government has committed to actually sanctify and respect. And that is one of the concerns that we specifically have. The other concern, of course, is we've also made changes. If you're close to the electricity sector, you've been asking yourself, if I choose to install a solar panel in my house, or if I'm an industry, and maybe I have excess power, am I going to be able to sell it to the grid? We envisage that as technology keeps changing, it's going to be likely that me and you are not just going to be consumers of electricity. We are going to be consumers of electricity. And we are seeing that across the board. We are seeing that in Zambia, we are seeing that in South Africa, we are seeing that in Namibia, we are seeing that in Kenya. So these changes that we are making are to actually prepare us to be able to do that when the time comes, to adopt all the various technologies. But also, without speaking much, 20 years ago, you had, Alan told you, had the generation, transmission, and distribution system. That has changed of recent. Okay? People can establish their generation plants, they can be combined as mini grid power plants, and then they can sell power to themselves or small communities. What we are envisaging is with this kind of concession, with this kind of changes, we should be able to accommodate that specifically. So, what is my take and what is my concern right now? One of my biggest concerns, and I think one of the resounding messages that we want to put forward there as a government, is that at the end of the day, it's extremely unlikely that we are going to see significant changes that will destabilize the market. A change is a natural occurrence. Everything that has happened right now in the buyout amount that has been reported by the press is not something that was not envisaged. And that's why the process is as simple. In January, the member indicated an amount to be considered. By the end of March, the Auditor General confirmed what he had audited, and then there is a 30-day process to reconcile and make accounts speak to that same facts. Okay? I must give credits to the people who drafted the concession agreements for the simple reason that all these things were kind of envisaged. Okay? We envisaged a change. And what is the change? The change that we specifically envisaged is that another entity could come in. That entity has become the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company. We envisaged a likelihood that Umeme would have a different perspective, government would have a different perspective. And what has been the solution? The solution that has been provided for is that we'll have a period during which reconciliations will actually be made to ascertain what exactly is the cost. Okay? We envisaged changes to be made to the market, and these changes are now beginning to happen. That possibly after 20 years, there may be a need, to have private capital, merge with public capital, Those days it was not possible. Right now, it was not possible. Meme has played its part. Some of the things that we have right now, the increased generation have been on account of attracting private capital, and that has been achieved. I think as a nation, as communities, as sectors, we now have to ask ourselves, how do I move beyond what I have right now to the next? So that power remains affordable. Power is not restricted to the people in Kampala, but it goes to the whole country. We can support industrialization so that everyone the country can be able to produce. There are so many changes that are happening right now in the electricity sector. So in my consideration, one of the things that I definitely see is that there is a period in which reforms have to be made, and this is the period that we are in. It's also not unusual for reforms to move forward, and backwards in regulatory reform. We've seen that across the board. We've seen that in South Africa, we've seen that in Uganda, we've seen that in Brazil and Chile and any other country. We've seen that in the UK. We've seen that in a number of countries. So right now we are in a phase where the government has not said, for instance, that it does not want private capital in the sector. No. The government has said that right now we've got to have a smarter and a more beneficial mix in the electricity sector. There have been changes that have been made. We need to be able to take account of them. Who are the biggest beneficiaries in terms of these changes? I think the biggest beneficiaries in terms of these changes are consumers, me and you. You're now able to communicate much more efficiently. You're now able to incorporate ICT into your systems. You now have more power, more reliable for a longer period of time. That used not to be the case 20 years back. You're now able to have power in some of your villages. Who have been the biggest beneficiaries? It is the consumers, me and you. And what we want to do is carry that further forward. And the government has not yet closed out private capital across the electricity sector. Just to give you a simple example, in transmission, we have recently opened up the transmission segment to be able to allow private capital. Previously, it was only government that was doing public capital in transmission. We have now opened it up, and we are saying that even where the government was right now, we want to introduce the same kind of concept that we had with Women Limited and begin to see that if I introduce private capital in transmission, will the transmission segment become efficient? But the government has many priorities. It has quite a number of priorities for distribution, and that is why I think what we are seeing right now is the beginning of the formulation of a relationship between the public and the private, specifically for purposes of seeing that at the end of the day, we can have a harmonious way in which both private capital and public capital come to the electricity sector. So it's an interesting phase. We've made a number of wins during this period of time. Women Limited is arguably one of the best utility, as one of the best utility companies on the continent. They still have options to extend that. They still have options, and many countries are looking at that. We want to step ahead of Africa. We don't want to remain here. We want to see that when you have done this, you also need to do the other, and the other, and the other. We want to remain a leader. We do not remain a leader by maintaining the same kind of structure. You become a leader by specifically improving the segment, by making changes, and by seeing that at the end of the day, these changes actually deliver the expectations of the public, the government, and all stakeholders. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Howell, for that wonderful presentation. This juncture, I'm going to call the questions. If there are any questions here, I will allow us to, our panelists will be answering the questions from where they sit. They can use the desk microphones. I'm going to call the questions. Are there any questions? As you prepare your questions, I have some online questions. The first question is addressed to Mr. Alan. It was raised by Ms. Susan. The question is, how will the transition impact the overall economy and social welfare of Uganda?
That's an interesting question. I'll probably share it with Harold. The idea of a transition is, it is expected that you now have a largely de-risked sector. If you compare the distribution sector now, even the whole electricity supply industry now, with the way it was 20 years ago, you will find that, I'll give you an example. When Umeme joined, when Umeme bid, because we bid for the license, there were 5 companies that bid before and they were not interested because they believed that the asset was toxic. Right now, I think if the government put out a bid right now, you'd have a stampede. And mainly because, one, the sector is more organized. When you have a sector that has structure that treats a public asset like a private entity, you have a regulator in place that keeps everyone honest. And I must admit, the regulator has gotten a lot more awards than most regulators we know. Then you have a sector that is one of 2 countries that has cost-effective tariffs, where if an investor puts his money in, he knows that he won't be relying on a government subsidy to get it back. I think this transition gives an opportunity for the government to continue to provide services at the level of a private entity. It will do 2 things. One, if the government takes on this job, the 20% return on investment could be absorbed by the government. And it could work in 2 ways, either lead to revenue for the government, or the government has stated that it could lead to lower tariffs for the consumers. So that 20%, I think, is now at 4%. Well, yeah. So they can afford to lower their rate of return and have the tariffs go down. So for the economy, a lower tariff could lead to reduced cost of business, and could lead to, you invest that money into increasing employment. It could lead to greater industrialization because the cost of power is a major input. And we've seen a very progressive tariff where, if you're extra large, you get power at a lower unit rate. And it is expected to see growth. And I think that is the reason why you have a growth in demand of 12%. That usually means that your economy is growing. If you want to know the economic growth, by how much more power people use. And I think in your home, if you use more power, maybe your neighbors will be borrowing more money from you. So I don't think I can speculate. I can actually state that over time we have seen it, and I think this trajectory will grow.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ali. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have one. Mine goes to Alan. Thank you for everything that you've done so far, the 20 years, but I have a question. I come from West Nile, Arua, and as I was growing up, we used not to travel to Arua because there was no power. Up to very recently, I think last year, that we were put on the national grid. So my question was, okay, we still have the answer because that was the time then. Why did it take almost forever for Arua or the West Nile to be put on the national grid? And the question really is because it has affected the region for so long that up to now, people are still not sure. Because those days, I think you remember when our power used to go off at midnight, and then you have to stay in the dark up to, I think it's been put back at 8. That inconsistency was really quite disturbing. Then the second question goes to Mr. Harold. If I got it right from both your submissions, which we are really grateful for, the government is now going to be the supplier of the power, UEDCL. We're wondering, given the previous, the different contracts that the government has had, can one service provider, that is UEDCL, still give us the guarantees of consistency? Because this is now government, this is no longer private. I hope the question is clear. How can we be sure that government as the supplier of electricity is going to be as effective, of course, as remember it was private, and for the remaining of time? Thank you so much.
something we've been discussing for about 20 years. I remember just starting out. So Umeme's concession area, because Umeme was not the only distributor. There were, at some point, there were 8. I think Wenreko is still licensed even now. Kalangala still has a license. So one of the challenges with being very far away from the center, or having like a lake between you and the dam, is they have to build a power line that will go from the generator to where you are, all the way to your home. I think the cost of construction was a bit oppressive at the time. And then there was a study done, what was it, 95? Where they were looking at the cost of constructing the line against the level of consumption of power. And at that time, I think they were suggesting that they build a dam in West Nile, which will now supply West Nile. We call it in island mode. I think that is in Nyagak. So they believed that it was more financially viable to build the plant near where the suppliers were than it would be to build a power line from, say, now Karuma. So the power line would be more expensive then, and then you have to recover that money through the tariff. So you've already sunk it, your tariff would be oppressive. So, and that is something that I think is also being considered. You want to have reliable power that is financial, that is not very expensive. Every generator now, and I think I will confirm this, has to confirm that they can operate in island mode for 2 reasons. If one dam goes down, it should not trigger a fault on your line. So you should be able to isolate your area. That leads to you making sure power is available. West Nile has grown in demand from the 1 megawatt 20 years ago to now being a major player. And I think with the growth in demand, there has to be growth in investment. And that is why of course, first of all, constructing Karuma, building the power lines, the fact that we might be exporting to Sudan. Now there's a justification for the transmission infrastructure to get to West Nile and then the distribution infrastructure. So it is expected that as part of the process, because now grid electricity is not the only source of power. If you're in a place where they require a lot of investment, they might start off by putting you in what they call an isolated grid, or providing for solar, and then later on, when the grid gets to you and it is not financially oppressive to give a return, then they add that on. So I hope that has helped. It's the same question that can come from Kalangala, we will give the same answer. Although I see, maybe Harold, the question I see, and then back to that later.
Okay, thank you. To the second question that you asked, Alan, you pretty much clarified why Wenreko and why you still have power now, but you also, I also want to underscore that right now we have about 41 generators. About 20 years back, possibly had about 3. Right now we have about 41 people generating power. Some of those generators are actually in West Nile, so it's a process that has come to change. You have Nyagak 1 and you have Nyagak 3 that's coming on. Now, to the service providers, how would you ensure consistency, and why should you have comfort that this year? For some reason, I sense a distrust of the ability of government companies to provide services, and that should not be the case. I want to underscore that government services what government companies actually do is that they release what we call, they go to places which may not be considered viable, okay? Because for instance, as a private company, you may not ask someone like Umeme Limited to go and give electricity to your person in the village, okay? That doesn't make economic sense. What governments come and do, they make it viable, attractive, and then possibly they step out. That's what we see across the globe, and that is what UABCL is going to do. But as they do that, does that mean that for the current people who are consuming electricity are going to have a problem? No, they're not going to have a problem. Why? As the same parameters that we gave to Umeme Limited are the same requirements that UEDCL actually has, if not possibly more stringent. Okay? So for instance, if Umeme, and we've had talks on losses and all manner of things, if Umeme Limited was required to always make sure the whole country has power for 24 hours or 20 hours, just by backhand of the calculation, that is not going to change. UEDCL still has the same obligation. Why should UEDCL be able to do that? If UEDCL does not achieve those targets that we give them, they will suffer a financial penalty. The same kind of financial penalty that we exposed to Member Limited is the same kind of financial penalty that UEDCL will actually be exposed to. So they have every reason to actually make sure that the lights are on, they distribute the power, they respond to your complaints on time. And now that Member Limited has given us very good data, we can even make smarter decisions concerning that. So it's one of those situations where we don't expect to see low service quality, but also increased service quality. But also I want to give comfort to the public and to yourself and everyone else. That if you look through the people that were running Member Limited, the same people have actually been absorbed into the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company, so they know what they need to do. There was a good skill transfer that we had from the Member Limited to UEDCL, and they're not changing their human resources. So these same people who are in Member Limited are the same people who are going to continue providing you service. So you should be able to see and have a good service. Thank you.
Thank you so much.